volunteers, just shoot me an email when you think there are enough people. We can get started.
I would just give it one more minute to let some, because it's just 12:30 now.
It's in the audience. Okay. Everyone. Just so Raina knows, Wendy Barrington just said hello and welcome.
Wendy.
Okay, so I'm going to get started, and we have a little bit of a long intro here, and I don't want to shortchange Dr. Croft and our opportunity for question and answers, but welcome everyone. This is our last lecture of the academic year. Glad you can be here with us today. Next week, we'll be holding an in-person congratulatory reception for our amazing graduate students who have accomplished so much this year. Please join us for those shout outs and light refreshments in person in 101 Rosling. You can also join for the first part for this presentation of a summary of what everybody's been up to and accomplished. But we will have light refreshments, and the doors and windows will be open for plenty of fresh air, and masks will be encouraged. So we'd love to see you in person, and I know the students would be happy to see you too. Before we begin, I'd like to share two sets of acknowledgements. First, our land acknowledgement. CSDE acknowledges we are located on Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, and other native peoples. This land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with Coast Salish lands, waters, peoples, and their other non-human kin. CSDE's commissioned logo from Native artist, UW professor Marvin Oliver, acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. Second, our funding acknowledgement. CSDE is extremely grateful for support from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, the School of Public Health, School of Social Work, the Business School, the Population Health Initiative, the eScience Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research. Now to welcome Dr. Raina Croft. Dr. Croft has a fascinating research agenda and brings to it remarkable interdisciplinary research background. Dr. Croft is assistant professor of neurology at the NIA Latent Aging and Alzheimer's Disease Center at Oregon Health Science University. Her work focuses on creating culturally celebratory approaches to physical activity, social engagement, and reminiscence therapy for healthier aging, particularly amidst the trauma of gentrification and its implications for older Black adults' cognitive health and social connectedness. She received a PhD in anthropology from Yale in 2009 and applies her training as an anthropologist of the African diaspora to designing brain health interventions that celebrate Black culture. She's going to be talking about her SHARP study, but let me just acknowledge her early career, which I think really makes her work particularly insightful and thoughtful. Dr. Croft began her career as an archaeological anthropologist of the African diaspora, leading excavation research on the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Gorée Island, Senegal, where she examined the intersection of human behavior, inequality, and material culture. Her early work was influenced by a focus on medical anthropology and how culture and society influence and are influenced by health, disease, and health beliefs. In more recent years, Dr. Croft has applied her anthropological lens to American Indian, Alaska Native traditional cultures, to substance abuse, disorder treatment, and currently to cognitive health, culture, cultural neuroscience, and neuroanthropology. So without further ado, thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Croft, for being here and sharing your work.
Hi, thank you so much. When you read it all out like that, it really sounds like I've had quite a meandering career, but I must say it has been very interesting, and it's all related. So I want to especially say thank you to Dr. Basha Belza for connecting me to this series. I've had a chance to look at a few of the speakers in the past and see those recordings, and I'm quite impressed. So I'm very honored to be here. Okay, let's get started. Okay, can everybody see what they're supposed to be seeing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, I'm very honored to be here, but I am also extremely honored to be working with my hometown community, with older Black adults in Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon is where I grew up, where I went to high school. I was born in the historically Black neighborhoods where this study takes place. And today I'll be talking about the gentrification of Portland and across the US overall, the implications of that for brain health and what that might mean for the ability to age in place successfully. And the SHARP study. SHARP stands for Sharing History Through Active Reminiscence and Photo Imagery, and it aims to maintain or improve brain health through walking and conversational reminiscence in the gentrifying historically Black neighborhoods of Portland. And I'm excited to say we're bringing this to Seattle, or it has already come to Seattle, and we're getting ready to launch a series of walks. And I'll go over that today and talk a little bit more about the expansion of SHARP.
Dr. Croft, I wanted to mention that what we're seeing is your sort of view of the, not the slide view, but the sort of notes in the preceding.
Okay. Let me try again.
There we go. Okay, try again, and we're not.
How's that?
Let's see. Yes, there you go.
Okay. And so before, did you see a Word doc of notes, or you saw a pre-slide? I'm just curious.
We just would see the next slide coming up.
The notes are private, behind the scenes. Okay, so, now I have to advance. All right, technical difficulties are over with. Everyone's seeing what they're supposed to see. Great. So I usually save this slide for last, and I have found that I have just been rushed through it, and I want to make sure that everybody gets their proper time in the sun. So I want to start off by thanking all of the wonderful people I work with students in particular, and working with the great SHARP Seattle board that we have is really one of the highlights of my career. So you can see on the right there, everyone who's been engaged in SHARP Portland. There's even more students who are not listed here, and our wonderful board here in Seattle, or I should say up there in Seattle. Just a pleasure to work with everybody, and my mentors, and they continue to encourage me and to walk with me through all the brainstorming about various barriers, and just really keep inspiring and help me to believe that SHARP is something that can be expanded to more cities. So the walk ahead today, I'm going to talk a little bit about gentrification and what we may know about implications for brain health. We'll be talking about SHARP methods and the preliminary health outcomes that we had in our 2 Portland pilots. And because I'm an anthropologist and a qualitative researcher, 100% at heart, we're going to really take a moment to examine participant reflections. And for me, understanding how participants perceive and the meaning they are making of what we're asking them to engage in, that really is the center of my work in developing really culturally rich, culturally celebratory programs that people want to stay engaged in, that will have better outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening with Sharp Seattle, what is happening with Sharp Oakland, and then we'll get into the community deliverables. What are the deliverables that we're leaving behind? You know, if the researchers were to step out, what have we left with the community that lasts longer than any of our temporary study endeavors? So are gentrification and brain health linked? Well, the short answer is there's just not enough conclusive evidence to say, you know, a resounding yes. So at best, we can say probably, or rather that gentrification exacerbates some of the risk factors, or many of the risk factors for cognitive decline. So first I want to take a step back and just describe a little bit about gentrification. And I'm sure that all of this is pretty familiar to this group here, but I want to describe this because this really fit Portland to a T. So predictors of likelihood of gentrification for an area are concentration of people with lower SES, adjacency to high income neighborhoods, proximity to downtown, higher population density, and retail development. Of course, these are sure signs that greater gentrification, more swift and rapid gentrification is on its way. And that includes boutiques and coffee shops, craft breweries, and especially for Portland, we can say heightened infrastructure around bike transportation. And Huang and Sampson found that it's usually racially mixed communities that are usually over 40% Black that appear the most attractive to retail and residential investors, as well as to middle-class white residents. Now, how people perceive gentrification and what's happening in their neighborhood differs among long-term Black residents and long-term white residents. So many long-term Black residents largely view gentrification-oriented retail spaces as exclusionary and culturally incongruent, while long-term white residents believe that they enhance the community. So Sullivan and Shaw, who found these conclusions in their own work, they were specifically talking about the albino neighborhoods in Portland where the Sharp study takes place. So I had made earlier a more complex slide here where I had outlined what white gentrification does and what Black gentrification does. But as I researched that a little bit more, it was really inconclusive. So I didn't feel comfortable, you know, clearly outlining this is what white gentrification does and this is what Black gentrification does. So what I'm interested in hearing from this group, maybe in the Q&A, if there is someone who's familiar with that, if maybe we can engage that in discussion. But does the race of the gentry matter? Does it matter for outcomes of long-term residents if those who are moving into the neighborhood are largely white and higher SES, or if they are Black, or if they are racially mixed? Well, I don't know that we know for sure, but we can say that Schmuel and colleagues found that as white gentrification increases, and actually all of these studies you see here, we're looking at areas that were experiencing an influx of, you know, mainly white population moving into the area. So we have found that racial discrimination, or as a neighborhood's white population increases, racial discrimination toward long-term residents of color increases. We see increased above average stress for longtime residents of color. And we see more preparation for bias behavior among residents of color. This is something that I found in focus groups that I'll be discussing a little bit later in this talk. And also Jeffrey Pruill, who's out at Brown, and myself, and Jessica Hebert and Barry Oken, we did focus groups around mindfulness and how we would adapt a mindfulness program to older Black adults in Portland. And gentrification and that stress was one of the main issues that came up for people. And they would discuss this feeling of having to get ready, feeling like they had to put on some sort of armor and anticipate racial discrimination when they would leave their homes. And then, of course, there's increased displacement, both culturally, okay, so remaining in the neighborhood, but feeling like you no longer belong because the character and the culture of the neighborhood has been drastically changed by the incoming group. And then there's, of course, physical displacement, where one can no longer afford their home, and so they are displaced physically from the neighborhood. And so displacement and erasure of Black businesses and spaces that foster belonging. So I've heard some discussion that, well, with Black gentrification, there tends to be more investment in existing Black businesses so that the character of the neighborhood is not as drastically transformed. And it sort of is an extension to this idea of placemaking, right? Which is a years-long process in the making. And so rather destroying and replacing businesses, they tend to invest in and extend sort of this notion of placemaking. Now, I'd be interested in hearing from all of you if you know of some, more concrete data-based evidence that can show this. So my question remains, does the race of the gentry matter? So let's get back to the idea of, does gentrification impact brain health? Well, we just discussed higher levels of stress from gentrification. This can be because of perceived discrimination. This can be because of financial stress. This can be because of the cultural displacement and the sense of no longer belonging in your neighborhood, or witnessing the displacement of your friends and family around you if you remain behind. And we know that higher levels of perceived stress are linked to increased and rapid declines in global cognition. We also know that perceived racial discrimination is linked to higher levels of diastolic blood pressure, depressive symptoms, and elevated C-reactive proteins, which is a marker of inflammation and a correlate of poor cardiovascular health. And poor cardiovascular health is linked to vascular dementia, which is the inability or the insufficient blood getting to the brain. And of course, displacement, when we think of friends and family moving away, whether the individual, the older adult that, whether it's the older adult who moves out and is displaced, or who is left behind as their friends and family move away. Close proximity social supports are fractured. The ability to walk down the street and have a neighbor who is literally, have family members who live within walking distance or a short driving distance, or knowing that you've got this service organization that is not far from you, or your church. So as those things move out of the neighborhood, this disrupts the social supports that are so critical for not only maintaining good brain health, as we grow older, but for the ability to successfully age in place in one's own home, in their own community. And this is important because we know that larger social networks are protective against dementia, depression, and stress. So with decreased social engagement, now imagine that you're living in a neighborhood, you've lived there your entire life. Maybe your parents have lived there, and now you're witnessing these, vast changes. And not only is there the intersectionality of well, in Portland, certainly, and I imagine, well, not imagine, and to be true in Seattle as well, being a Black individual in a largely white city, and also being an older adult, and then seeing the character of your neighborhood and having your own sense of belonging sort of being erased from beneath you, you may not be as motivated to get out and be as socially engaged. And maybe you'll have less access to those places where you used to engage because they're simply not there anymore. And so decreased social engagement, this is critical for brain health. It's linked to increased depression and anxiety in older adults, including for caregivers who are aging in place in gentrifying neighborhoods. And we know that caregivers of people living with dementia, their health often declines more rapidly than the person they are caring for because of increased stress, reduced social activity, and reduced physical activity. And all of these are critical for developing, maintaining good brain health into old age, of course, which then supports successfully aging in place. So it's not only the brain health that you need to age in place, of course, but it is the network of social supports within close physical proximity and that you have good access to that enables that as well. So depression and anxiety, this is linked to subjective memory change in older Black Americans and to faster rates of cognitive decline and increased Alzheimer's disease and related dementia risk among older adults overall. So while the evidence is not directly saying that gentrification is bad for brain health, what we are seeing is that the effects of gentrification that I just listed are risk factors for cognitive decline. You know, stress is a very well-known risk factor for cognitive decline. And so what you're seeing here is we're seeing that with higher neighborhood deprivation, there's evidence for lower cognitive functioning. Okay, this is known in the literature. So it seems that gentrification would be a good thing because there are many improvements with gentrification. There's greater access to green spaces, there's less crime, there's greater access to healthy foods. There's more greenways, and people may feel safer to be out and walking because there's less crime. However, even amid gentrification-related improvements, we have seen lower self-reported mental health. Even though self-reported health may be higher, it's the mental health that is that people are struggling with. We also see that as gentrification-related displacement increases, well, that motivation to engage physically and socially in one's neighborhood decreases. And with lower decreased physical and social engagement, we have higher dementia risk. So the CDC recognizes gentrification is a public health issue because of the effects on stress and mental health. So when I began to look at, well, what is, is there anything we can concretely say? Is there any link that we can say gentrification, cognitive decline? And while we can't say that, I've looked at some of the systematic reviews. There are not a lot. If you do a PubMed search and you say gentrification, health, systematic review, you only get about a page or 8 or 9 references. And so 2020 is one of the earliest known systematic reviews of health and gentrification. And really what they found was that there was little to no overall association between gentrification and health outcomes, but that gentrification was repeatedly associated with undesirable health effects among Black and economically vulnerable residents. And with Schnecke, Mal, and colleagues, their systematic review, which came out about the same time, what they found was that there was just too much discrepancy between how studies were designed. And they said, what we really need to do is to follow people within and across neighborhoods over time, right? And that researchers need to employ consistent reference groups, and they need to include theory-driven controls and exposure measures. They need to consider and describe different types of gentrification and neighborhood change processes. So there remains a lot of work to be done before we can concretely know what is the effect of gentrification on the cognitive health of older adults. Now, while there may be some literature on gentrification and health, it's still a whole nother level to see, well, what is that health specifically on older adults? And then what is that health impact specifically on the cognitive health of older adults? So I'm hoping that within the coming years, we will have more evidence to really better understand that relationship. So thinking about all of this, gentrification aside, let's say, we already know that African Americans are about twice as likely to develop cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's disease, because of chronic conditions, of hypertension, diabetes, obesity. And it's very important that I add, because of historical and ongoing systemic inequities, right? If we simply say they're at twice as likely the risk of white people and we leave it at there, that puts the onus on African Americans, on something to do with our culture or our genes, when really the onus needs to be on the systems in which we live and the inequalities that are that persist within those systems. So despite having higher risk for cognitive decline because of social inequities, there is lower perceived risk among Black American communities, less knowledge about Alzheimer's disease and the risk factors, there may be less concern, or there is less concern because there's less knowledge about it. And there's less likelihood to seek early care, largely because many people think that, well, that's just grandma, that's just part of growing old. But what I think is in the middle, but sort of stands in the middle between the higher risk and the other factors you see on the right side, is there needs to be greater access to quality, right? Everyone says there needs to be greater access to quality health information and care and interventions, but I want to emphasize to culturally engaging interventions, which is essentially what the SHARP study is about. Now, when I say culturally engaging, that is more than culturally sensitive or culturally relevant. I'm sure you've heard many similar terms. And to me, those terms imply that one can relate to it, right? It is relevant. But culturally engaging, to me, this means actively contributing to the process of culture making. And that is what SHARP does. And I'll make more clear what that culture making looks like in the walking and reminiscence intervention a little bit later. So this is a visual of gentrification in Portland from 1990 to 2010. And you can see these clusters of neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland went from around 20 to 25% white in 1990 to around 50 to 90% white in 2010. And that trend has continued, though there are policies in place to rehouse, to repopulate displaced groups. So the number of gentrifying neighborhoods has doubled since 1980. Oh, and I want to especially call out this number you see on the side, that the population prior to gentrification, during this time period, was 13,331 Black Americans, right? And after this time, that cut the population in half in this area to around 7,000 individuals, with people moving to outlying areas like Gresham and Beaverton. And I don't know how many of you are very familiar with Portland and surrounding areas. But this is a trend, of course, that you all know is happening across the nation. But I want to get back to the idea of health and gentrification. So Smith, Lenning, and Kim, their 2018 study, they looked at 6,810 community dwelling respondents from the National Health and Aging Study, combined with the 1970 to 2010 National Neighborhood Change Database. And they found that economically vulnerable older adults in gentrifying neighborhoods reported higher rated health than their counterparts in neighborhoods not undergoing gentrification, but again, lower mental health and more depression and anxiety symptoms. So honing back in on Portland, okay, all of you are probably familiar with some of the processes that lead to gentrification. It's a years-long process in the making, okay? It happens well before the first, gluten-free dog goodies shop shows up, or the first coffee shop shows up. It is a process of disinvestment over the years that leads to decay, right? People are systematically denied home improvement loans, which is so unbelievable because this is areas where they were redlined to in the first place, right? And older Black adults Black adults, the community came to the Albina area in Portland after World War II, and there's a whole other history about Vanport and how that was flooded, and people then came to move into the Albina district. And I'm not representing that history very well. That's a different talk, but they were redlined, and all of you, of course, are probably familiar with the process of redlining. So this is the only area in which people could live, right? And yet they were being denied home improvement loans to improve their properties. And so this literally opened up spaces, right? As houses were condemned to blight and lots were literally cleared, this physically opened up spaces for redevelopment. So it looked like redevelopment was a good thing. We are saving this neighborhood that has fallen to decay, where people don't want to take care of their neighborhoods, when in fact they were trying, but they were not given access to those resources. And then, of course, with redevelopment comes this is the process of gentrification and eventually displacement. And so I'm going to talk in a moment about some focus groups we did in preparation for the SHARP study. And this individual here from the focus group says, he describes this process that I'm talking about. He says, you've got Black businesses that went out of business because of concerted efforts, racist efforts by the city and policies implemented that kept you from fixing the roof on your house, fixing the porch on your house, getting a liquor license to run your business. So in preparation for understanding what are the barriers to healthier aging in Portland, and this was sort of the birth of the SHARP study, was we did focus groups with Preserve Coalition for African American Memory and Brain Health, which is a Portland-based group, and the Urban League of Portland, with 41 adults aged 45 and over. And what we found was that, the overall question was barriers to healthier aging. But gentrification almost instantly rose to the surface as the dominant theme of conversation. And we found that they were experiencing increased transportation barriers, either to get out to those who have been displaced or to try to make it back to the areas that people were displaced from, where their church may still have been, or where their family members maybe perhaps still resided. Increased isolation among older adults, division of families as some stay and some leave the gentrifying areas. Of course, dispersal of social supports, which we have talked about earlier when we talk about the fragmentation of social networks. And we found a decrease in walkability in the new neighborhoods where people were relocating to. These are neighborhoods that are largely built around highways and strip malls, and just not as walkable as the very convenient close proximity to downtown, very walkable neighborhoods of North and Northeast Portland. And we also saw decreased motivation to walk and socialize for both those who remained behind in gentrifying neighborhoods, as well as those who now had to find their way in their new neighborhood. And by finding their way, I mean not just, literally knowing the lay of the land, but getting to know the social landscape as well. They just weren't as motivated because that was more of a foreign landscape. And of course, this relates to decreased neighbor dependence and trust. And all of these things that I've mentioned here are critical for not only cognitive health, but for being able to successfully age in place in your own house. So these things that we've talked about the ability to be engaged socially and to be in a place where you feel a sense of belonging, where you have access to social opportunities, whether those are planned or impromptu, whether you come across those from walking in your neighborhood and seeing neighbors that you know and recognizing shop owners and service organizations. And then we've talked a little bit about, feeling comfortable being physically active in your neighborhood, having a reason to go out. And just being really comfortable with where things are located and sort of where you fit in, spatially to the landscape, I guess you could say. And then there's reminiscence. We haven't talked a lot about or at all about reminiscence, but what we found in the focus groups was there was this reminiscence of this rich African-American culture, right? People were more or less forced to live in this area because of redlining. And yet there was this strong social network and this strong sense of cultural belonging and community that had developed that really allowed people to thrive within their communities. And they were reminiscing, actually, let me say they were lamenting, right, about the disruption to that and the loss of that, and really wondering what does this mean for their future. Well, these three categories here are critical for brain health. We know that social engagement improves cognitive reserve, it reduces stress, it curbs cognitive decline, and improves quality of life. We know that reminiscence improves brain function and well-being, and it also improves accommodative and assimilative coping. And walking, of course, there's so much data about walking and its benefits for overall health, let alone for brain health. But we know that just 2 hours of walking per week improved Alzheimer's disease patients' attitudes and their cognitive assessment scores. So this brings us to the walking, talking, and remembering portion, which describes the SHARP methods. So we took those three areas that we know are critical for brain health: social engagement, walking, and reminiscence. And this is occurring within the historically Black neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification. And the entire framework is culturally celebratory. And I'll explain that in a moment. First, I want to say that just the act of walking and being socially engaged and reminiscing, this is a multimodal intervention, and it addresses multiple modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline, isolation, depression, and cardiovascular health, or just some of those modifiable risk factors. And so SHARP, again, sharing history through active reminiscence and photo imagery. So what SHARP is it's a walking study, and it's walking in triads. So we had 2 pilots. Each pilot had 21 individuals, or 7 triads. And the first pilot in 2016 and 17 was just getting out all the kinks and the logistics. And so those were cognitively healthy individuals who were engaged in that study. In the second study, we were able to add some health outcomes now that we had ironed out the logistics. And so we had triads were 2 cognitively healthy older adults. This is age 55 and older, and 1 person experiencing mild cognitive impairment according to a Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And so this is not a thorough cognitive battery. It is an assessment that indicates people may be experiencing more memory loss than is normal for their peer group. And so that's called mild cognitive impairment. And so they walked 3 times a week for 6 months, or 24 weeks. And we took pre-post measures that included weight and blood pressure and the cognitive assessment. And then at week 4, 12, and 24, we had focus groups where we tried to understand, what is the cultural significance of the walking and talking and remembering? I should probably fill you in on what the remembering is about. So they walk, like I said, 3 times a week, and they're using a group tablet that is, preloaded with the SHARP walking application. And I have a slide that will show you a little bit more about that. And so these images are GPS linked, and they will pop up as they're walking throughout the neighborhood. And this will be their conversation prompt. And so our hypothesis was really that situating brain health within an existing community priority, which was gentrification, right? Everybody was talking about the need to preserve the legacy, this, not only the African-American legacy, but also the legacy that was disappearing with older Black adults because of memory problems. Okay, so situating brain health within this existing community priority will motivate sustained engagement for better cognitive health outcomes. So this is the walking application that they have access to. There's 1 tablet per group, because we don't want everyone, walking around looking down at their device. This is a group activity. And so you can see the first screen, they log in. Now we have it where they can just scan a QR code. And so we know that they are participating in that walk. There's a series of routes they can select from. We have 72 themed walking routes for our Portland routes. There are some health and safety reminders, like, please stop if you are feeling lightheadedness. We also remind them to walk at a moderate pace where it's still comfortable to hold a conversation, but they're not necessarily strolling. And then the map will turn green as they advance along the route. And there are 3 memory markers, which are GPS linked images of historical neighborhood images. These can be of just, everyday life. These can be of special events, of special notable people, or just of just regular everyday celebrations as well, or everyday life. And then at the end, it will show how far they've walked. It'll be a congratulatory message. They can see their pace. And you can see here also, we were still testing out the technology. So we did prepare participants with paper copies, which was good because some people were intimidated by the technology, and just knowing that they had a backup paper copy, if they became flustered with the technology, or if the technology did not work, that they could still continue their walk. And they had a backup recorder too, so that we never lost any of their conversational reminiscence sessions. So we have 27 walk themes you can see on the left-hand side, and you have an example of one of our walks here. And there's 2 questions for each prompt. There are only 3 memory markers per route, and they're about equal distance apart. And so our walks range from very lighthearted, like social clubs, to a little bit more serious, where we talk about the challenges facing women, and talking about, the lives that have been lost to police brutality. So what's interesting, I think, about this last prompt is that we can then look at walks that happened before the murder of George Floyd and hear how older adults were talking about police brutality and the history of this, and about the Black Lives Matter movement, to what their conversations will look like now in 2022. So not only are they creating history through these conversational reminiscence sessions, but we're able to sort of look at the trajectory of how they talk about history as different events unfold in our current times. Here's another slide to just give you an idea of the types of images that we're using. So was cognitive health maintained or improved from walking 3 times a week for 6 months and being engaged in conversational reminiscence? Well, we did our pre-post MOCA. First, I want to point out that I'm focusing here on the second cohort, because that is the cohort where we actually were doing health measures. So 18 out of 21 individuals stayed, over 6 months. So that's 86% retention rate. So that idea of motivating people to stay engaged seemed to have worked. And we can see that the red circle here, that is the end study results for these various categories. And I won't go over each of them individually, but while they were not statistically significant, all of them point towards overall positive change. And then what you see on the left is pre-post cognitive assessment scores. Let's see, looking at the delta there, the change between pre and post, we have anywhere from increasing in 6 points on their cognitive assessment to decreasing by 6 points. So there was quite a range there. And on the second table, what you see that half of our 18 individuals who completed the study had improved cognitive assessment scores, and 33% had decreased scores. Now, for those of normal cognition, you can see their results there, but I want to focus on those with mild cognitive impairment. 63%, which sounds great, though remember it's only 5 participants. We had 8 individuals who had mild cognitive impairment. So there were 7 triads, and one group actually had 2 people with mild cognitive impairment. But overall, there were 8 individuals. 63% had improved scores. And not only were they improved, but the score change was statistically significant. So we think we are definitely onto something, but obviously we need a more conclusive, larger trial to show this. So we had a lot of discussion about stress, depression, and anxiety earlier on in this talk. And so I wanted to highlight our findings around mood. So we asked participants, what was your mood right after a group walk? And we see that from month 1 to month 6, that improved, with more people saying that they had better moods right after group walks. But what's impressive to me is when we ask people, what has your mood gotten better, remained the same, or gotten worse since group walking began overall? And by month 6, 100% of our sample said that their mood had gotten better. And that's important because these walks aren't necessarily easy. I'm not talking about physically, but emotionally and mentally, because these walks are difficult and they're reminding people of what has been lost. Now, while we are being celebratory and we're highlighting the richness and the vitality of the African-American culture that was there and that continues to maybe not be there physically as strongly as it was before, just a little bit more dispersed. Well, what I want to say is we are actually still there very strongly. So I do not want to undermine that at all. But it also reminded people of how much was lost and if they would ever have that sense of really tightly knit community again. So having improved mood despite all of that was important because we certainly don't want to contribute to depression, which is a risk factor for cognitive decline when we're trying to improve brain health. So looking at motivational factors. So people were asked to rate these various factors that you see listed here. If they were extremely motivating or all the way down to a 4, not a motivating factor for me. And what we found, what you see highlighted in red here, that from month 1 to month 6, motivation stayed consistently high. So consistent rankings of extremely or very motivating from month 1 to month 6. And where we got low scores was the using or learning new technology. And this was a pilot. There were still technology kinks to work out. The tablet froze, just stuff that happens with technology. And that was frustrating to people. Yet, despite those frustrations, they were strongly committed to this because of the history that they were producing, right? The idea I mentioned before of being culturally engaging, of culture making through their recorded conversational reminiscence. I failed to mention earlier, a major motivation was, recording these memories for future generations. And these memories will be stored on a website. So we're creating an oral history digital archive. That was probably something really important I should have mentioned before, but all of their sessions are recorded. Okay, memory, health, and participant perspectives. If you want more information on what participants thought about the intervention development and any tips for doing walking type interviews, I have 2 publications out, but I'm going to talk just briefly on mental health impact and participants' perceptions of memory, health, and change as a result of engaging in these walks. So first off, the SHARP study helped participants to identify and reckon with cognitive decline. And that's an important first step, to recognize that they have it. It's not going to get better unless there are things they do to mitigate the advancement of cognitive decline, like walking and being socially engaged. This person says, it has made me admit that I do have a memory problem, and it's not going to go away, and working on the health things that I need to do. It was an eye-opener how much memory I had lost. Yeah, it was a teacher for me, you don't have to grow old sitting. So I'm going to dive into some participant perspectives on their own mental health and the experience of doing these walks. So Davidson and Lees asks us to take a phenomenological lens to understand structures of feeling and the emotional geographies of bereavement associated with displacement. And I want to add with cultural displacement as well, particularly among older adults. And Gibbons and Barton say that, it's actually the subtle effects of cultural displacement rather than physical displacement that may be more detrimental to health for low-income residents of color. So I call this first quote multiples of change, okay? Because not only is there just change that happens because you're growing older, and you may notice more memory loss, maybe more physical impairment, but then you're also having to negotiate changing neighborhood, changing culture, changing and shifting social supports. This person says, so you're flooded with all these memories, which is good because you remember some good times too, but then you have these issues around change, and where do I fit in? So it starts making you think about those things. And I've been able to process that without getting angry. At first, you're kind of like, well, they didn't have to tear that down. Things are changing, and they're changing very fast. There's more things that are going to be gone that used to be there. This one I call facing emotions. And so this person says, I am aware of the emotional roller coaster that take place during these walks. As we see what used to be, and now there's something new there. It's tied to memories, and it takes a lot of energy to go through some of that. This person, I call this one, this really shows the value of walking with 2 other individuals, right, who understand what you're going through, and the peer support, and how it takes this energy to sort of get under the layers of grief, of gentrification, to excavate the good that is there. This person says, it made me walk past my mother's house, and I had not done that since she passed away. My walking partner said, come on, come on. Then I started talking about all the changes and the people that lived in the community and what they did at that time, but it was part of my growing, and I had to do it. Now, this person talks about how they look at this process now. Okay, and I call it same feelings, but different observer. Now I feel a little bit differently. I mean, I still feel the same sadness. I still feel irritation. I feel anger at times. This program has been great for just taking me through all of those feelings of sadness. And this last quote is now going from, okay, now I know how I feel. I'm experiencing this walk. I've gone through the emotional work of dealing with and discussing this with people who know exactly how I feel. What am I going to do? How am I going to transform this experience into action? So as compared to the last time, which was more of a sense of adventure because it was brand new and just seeing how I felt. Now I know how I feel about seeing things and walking in the changes. But now I'm looking at, what do I do with these feelings? How am I just going to go back to my life as usual? Well, to me, it's for more than just a study. What can I personally address now? I'm already a little more active with seniors, but then the youth. How do I take the things that I've seen, the things that I remember? How do I express that to them? How can it help them? So I really wanted to get to this point faster, but I do not want to shortchange at all what we're doing in Seattle. I'm very excited that we're bringing this to Seattle. Walking will take place June through September. And an integral part of I would say the framework of how SHARP works is engaging BIPOC scholar mentors. And I'll show those mentors in a moment. But we have conducted, or rather the students have conducted, 2 focus groups to learn about what sort of landmarks are important. And then those 12 routes have been created, and we'll be engaging 36 older Black adults with and without memory loss over 4 weeks. So their triads will be walking just for 1 month. We'll have evaluative focus group at the end of their participation, and we'll begin that long process of the community deliverables, which is another talk in terms of, how do we go through the oral history? How do we make it accessible online? And how do we make sure that it's representing well the participants and so forth? And you can see on the right-hand side the measures that we're doing. And we really want to make this feel like a program, a little bit less like a study. So for now, we're not including a whole lot of measures. But CSD is, I should have spelled that out, that is a depression scale. Oh, and I want to highlight all these wonderful partners that we're working with. You can see that up in the right-hand corner, and this will take place in the Central District. So I'm going to skip this. Go ahead and take a quick look at the images. This is one walk that I created, but please pay attention mostly to the students in the lower corner. They are the ones making these routes. This is a route that a student made that I want to highlight, and she recently presented on her work and won an award. This is Leah Kaluna, so congrats to her on that. All of the students are making incredible walks, and so this walk starts off with at Mount Zion Baptist Church, and the questions are, which communities did you feel you belonged to in your youth? In what ways did you build community inside and outside of religious communities or other organizations? And participants will walk past the Royal Esquire Club and have some reflections about that, as well as remembering the Mardi Gras parade. So I think I'll skip Oakland. Just suffice it to say, we're starting to develop walks in West Oakland, which is undergoing intense gentrification and is a place that was densely populated by Black adults. These are some of the images that we're working with. And then I just want to say real quick about what are these community deliverables? Well, we're taking the walking and reminiscence that happens within the intervention, and we're able to apply those to learning sessions, talk and taste community groups or community sessions where we have an educator or a speaker about some health issue related to brain health. And then we have group sessions where we have people can sit or stand and enjoy some Motown oldies, and we do a dance session. And then we also turn our chairs together in groups of 3 and have Remember Together sessions. So we're able to take this from the streets into community programming as well. And this is a website that we're building where we're able to integrate the stories that we're gathering on the conversational reminiscence on the walks, and then pair that with health information to make it more relatable, more engaging, and just also in a very celebratory tone, that we come from a rich social network and community, and that we can continue to be engaged in that way. So I just want to say thank you for allowing me to present my work. We have so many partners. I'm very excited to see how this will unfold in Seattle, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Raina. Just want to shout and clap and really appreciate the entire talk. We have only a few minutes here. And so I do want to encourage anybody who's online or in the audience, if they have a question for you, to go ahead. I'll unmute you, allow you to talk. It's pretty exciting that it's coming to Seattle. I know this is a topic of concern for so many of us. And this is a beautiful study. It's lovely. So I'm just looking for, like, I almost want to call on Clara Barrich, who I know is on, or Wendy, for some questions. Raise your hands, let me know. Thank you, Julie. Okay, here's somebody who has their, just take me a minute to get the question. Person, Clara, yay, okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Raina. What an exciting set of projects. I have a question about your measures, and forgive me if I missed where you might have already discussed measures of belonging. And then also I wondered if you're looking at potential impact on help seeking or healthcare, specifically for MCI or dementia.
Those are great questions. Our measures of belonging are purely qualitative right now. So just getting people's perspectives on what neighborhood change means to them and how they feel when they are out walking. I do want to say, though, with that, people have said that this feels like activism when they're walking, that by them physically being there, it says that they are still here. And just as important for them to be walking, it's important that they are seen, not only for them to see the change, but for them to be seen. And in fact, when we're walking, we walk with them for the first 3 walks, and then they walk on their own together. And Black people will literally pull over and say, I saw my people walking. I had to ask what you're doing. And the fact that they're even pulling over to see what looks like a rarity in what used to be, the Black neighborhoods, sort of speaks to itself and speaks to that idea of belonging. So right now, purely qualitative. And apologies, I forget what the other measure question is that you had.
I wondered about help seeking in terms of healthcare for memory loss specifically, if that increased after doing this intervention.
Qualitatively, it did. Again, I'm a qualitative researcher. I would love to see some quantitative data on that. We have several quotes where people are describing how this has made them more aware of their own memory loss, is one that I shared with you. And so that they were actually able to bring that up at their next visit, and that they were, seeking care for that and wondering what else they can do. So that's on the qualitative side. On the quantitative side, we include a question about, how does this, I can't remember the exact wording, but how does this, if at all, affect how you will seek information or care for memory loss and cognitive decline. And so I don't have those results to share with you right now, but in terms of anything more extensive than that, we don't have that, but it is certainly something that we should consider. And let me know if you have any ideas of which measures that we could use for that.
Dr. Prof, there's a question in the Q&A. It goes back to a period about 1 p.m. when you were presenting on a slide that had the acronym MMSE, and they wanted to know, what does MMSE?
Yeah, so that's a cognitive assessment. It's mini mental state examination. And that is a way to assess, the degree of memory loss. But what we have found is that the MoCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is actually harder and therefore more accurate in detecting a little bit more nuanced change in memory loss. So at first in the SHARP study, we were using MMSE to determine, status of, people were cognitively healthy or impaired. And then in the second pilot, we switched to the pre-post Montreal Cognitive Assessment. So those are cognitive assessments, MMSE and the MoCA. They're not full on batteries. These are just like 30 question assessments.
Thanks. Let's see if I'm trying to manage that. I do have a question myself, which has to do with two parts, but are you presenting your results to the participants and sharing the results of the research? And if so, what have been their reactions? And the second question has to do with, have you been in discussion with community partners who might be implementing some of the findings, the early findings from your research in building community and enhancing well-being of aging members?
Great, yeah. So the first question, yes, we are presenting our results. So we make sure that people are aware of talks. We've had folks come to talks in person at OHSU, and just making sure that not only are we sharing, what we're doing, but we let them we help them recognize that these results are being shared to national audiences and that people are interested in this, and that they are advancing the field of how we understand perceptions of aging in place in gentrifying neighborhoods, that there's not a lot of data on the connection between gentrification and brain health, or even the voice of older Black adults in particular about how this affects their ability to age in place. And so we're letting them know that their reflections and the time and energy that they're spending are important to us locally, but also to a national audience as well. And the second question, remind me.
Whether your findings are now being translated into programs that community partners might be developing, or
Well, our main community partner is Preserve Coalition for African American Memory and Brain Health. And then that group, of course, is partnered with the Alzheimer's Association here in Portland, the Portland chapter, or the Oregon chapter, and with Providence, and with the Urban League, and with I'm forgetting on the spot all of our partners, and various community clinics, North by Northeast Clinic, and so forth. I know I'm probably forgetting like a major partner, so forgive me. But so we are doing these talk and taste, which I briefly touched upon. And in person, those would attract upwards of 80 people in our target population. We have transferred that over to Zoom, which is not as successful. But from that, we are working with AARP, who's one of our partners, in trying to develop a computer literacy, more like a social media or Zoom literacy work group. And we'll be piloting that soon. And that is so important because even though it looks like COVID is coming and going, but still we know that the Zoom platform is here to stay. And so we want to make sure that people are engaged. So there are like offshoots, but what I would like to see is looking at, not the reminiscence sessions, but also really the focus groups. That's when we get into how people feel about all of this and how they're questioning, well, what does this mean for them in the years to come? I would really like for policymakers to listen to that data and to consider, how to make housing affordable, how to focus more on age-friendly and dementia-friendly cities plans. So that's how I would like to see this being put into action in a way that actually improves the quality of life for displaced older adults.
Thank you. Well, we had one more question in the Q&A. It's really rhetorical and it's a nice one to wrap things up. My question is rhetorical. It's from anonymous attendee, so I'm not sure who it's from, but my question is rhetorical for everyone. So when is your next walk in your neighborhood? walking is so brilliant. This presentation was to thank you, Dr. Croft. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to you being here in Seattle and maybe sharing the results from Seattle at a future date. And happy to, if you want to send me the information about the upcoming study, I'm happy to put it into our newsletter if that seems appropriate. We're happy to share it out.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here today.
Thanks. Take care. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.